Alrighty, here we have a bit of a different video. There are no prerequisite skills that we're relying on here. We're looking at what happens or different methods for surveying a population. Now, why do we survey a population instead of taking a different option would be taking a census, say asking everybody within a population what they think about something. Well, sometimes you don't have the funds, sometimes you don't have the time, sometimes you don't have the resources to go asking every single person within a population, which is the entire group that you care about. So instead what you do is you just take a smaller portion of that population, you take a sample of the population, which represents, you use them to represent the entire population, and you make some assumptions from there based off of the information you can collect from the sample. So there are a few different sampling techniques that are used in different situations that have their own advantages, that have their own disadvantages when you're working through. So the first sampling technique is simple random sampling, where each member of the population has an equal chance at being selected. Now, if that's the case, an example would be like drawing names from a hat. So if we take the names of every single student in a class, every single student in the school, and we put them into a hat, we mix up the hat, and we draw some names from that hat. Well, everyone has an equal chance at being selected. So from there, that's how we could choose a sample. We could ask some questions of those who are chosen in order to work forward. Now, what that would look like, if you're working with a nice deck of cards, which many of you are familiar with, what that would look like if we're taking a sample of a deck of cards, what we would do is we would shuffle all of them all together. We would shuffle them, I don't know, maybe take 5-10 minutes, really shuffle it, make it completely random, and then you pull out, we select some random cards from the deck in order to come up with what might be a sample, what might be a random sample of our deck, and we would ask some questions of just those cards who are pulled out of the deck to make some assumptions on the entire deck altogether. Okay, well, if that's the case, that's a simple random sample. That is among the easiest sampling techniques to visualize. Now let's keep going. Okay, so a stratified sample is where you split up, is where you separate your data or where you separate your population into different groups, right? And each of these groups might be specified maybe by gender, by nationality, by location, by grade. If we're working with a deck of cards, maybe by suit, maybe by number, but we separate them into different groups. These groups are called strata. That's why it's called a stratified sample. So these groups being strata, and then we ask the question, or we select randomly from each of those groups. We randomly select to make sure that every single group is represented. Now, these groups do not necessarily need to be the same size. If we're working with a deck of cards, they might all be the same size, and we might say, okay, well, let's separate our data or our cards into suits. We'll say, okay, now we have 4 equal-sized suits, and we're going to randomly select from these suits. We're going to make sure that each suit is represented, and each suit has the same, within the suit, each card has the same opportunity at being represented, but we would make sure that every single suit itself is represented within our sample that we're asking our questions from, so that we make sure that we hear from the clubs, we hear from the diamonds, we hear from the hearts, and we hear from the spades. Now, again, I'll emphasize our strata, our groups that we separate this population into, do not need to be the same size. Instead, say I could take a look at my face cards. I could call those one group, and I could call the rest of the cards another group, and I could work from there. And I could make sure, okay, so now each of my face cards at this point would actually have a greater chance at being selected than each of my other cards. And let's say we make up our sample by 3 from each group. And I would end up with, okay, 3 face cards from here, and then I would also make sure that I end up with 3 cards from my numbered values over here, and I might end up with cards from the same suits, I might end up with cards from different suits, but either way, we're not focused on the suit right here. We were making sure that each group was represented, and those groups here were face cards or numerical values. So that is what it looks like if we're working with a stratified sample. At this point, we've taken a look at 2 different sampling techniques. A voluntary response sample is made up of members who have volunteered to respond. An example of this might be, say, on a radio, where you say, okay, anybody who wants to volunteer can call in and share their thoughts. Or it might be, say, within a school, okay, anybody who wants to give us some information can stop by this classroom on their lunch and tell us what they think. Right? That is a voluntary response sample where the volunteers are going to be those people who show up and provide their input. Now, at that point, if you have a voluntary response sample, what usually happens is the people who show up are those who care the most about what you're asking. Right? If you're asking students within a school to provide their input on how they feel about the upcoming basketball game, the people who show up are going to be those who feel very passionately about basketball, whether they feel passionately and they love it or whether they feel passionately and they hate it. Those are likely going to be the people who respond the most when you're collecting that data for a sample. Lastly, we'll look at a convenience sample, even easier. They're made up of members of the population that are easy to reach or easy to collect or easy to ask about. Right? Now, if we were doing that, if we were trying to collect some information on students in the school, we might stand right outside our doorway and ask anyone who walks by. If we were working with a deck of cards and we had a nice stack of a deck of cards, those who are easiest to reach are probably those right on top of the deck of cards. Maybe it happened to be sorted already. Those might be the ones that you select. They are just those that are closest to your hand, that are most easily collected. That is called a convenience sample, and that's because it's convenient for you to collect. So if we're looking at a question right here, if we are really practicing our ability to understand populations and samples and the difference right here, a total of 100 students are surveyed, 20 from each grade, including a fifth year, so a Victory Lap, from a school that has 1,250 students. What's the population? Well, the population is going to be all of the students, all students. Now that's different from the population size. What is the population size? Is 1,250 students, right? So the population is a description of the people that we're talking about. In this case, that is all students. Now what's the sample size? Okay, well the sample size that we're working with is going to be, let's see, 20 from each grade. Oh, they already did that for us, 100 students. Nice and easy. What percentage of the population is the sample size? Well, what we would do is for our percentage, we would just take the number of students that we are collecting right here, that's 100, divide it by 1,250 students, throw that right into our calculator, and end up with 0.08. We can turn that into a percentage. That is 8% of students. We turned it into a percentage by multiplying it by 100%. Now, what kind of a sampling technique is used here? Okay, so our sampling techniques that we have just discussed, we've discussed a simple random sample where each member of the population would have an equal chance at being selected. Is that the case right here? Well, you might look at the total people in this school and you might say, you know what? Each grade has a different number of people in it. In fact, those who have come back for a Victory Lap, probably that's the fewest number of people within a certain grade in the school, so they would have a higher chance at being selected because we're selecting 20 from each grade. So does everyone here, have an equal chance at being selected? Absolutely not. This is not a simple random sample. Now, we could then look, okay, a stratified sample is where a population is divided into groups, and then a random sample is collected on each group. Okay, were the students here separated into groups? Yes, they were separated by grade, right? So here we have what we call a stratified sample, where we made sure that each grade was represented within our sample. That's the advantage of a stratified sample. A voluntary response sample, again, would be just asking students to come down. A convenience sample would just be asking students who are nearby. This was neither. This was a stratified sample. We will go into types of bias as well. I'm just going to throw that into one other video because at this point it's getting a little bit long. Nice work here, folks.